Hi BookTube, and welcome to another Middlemarch meditation. Today we're going to cover the second half of chapter 27, which contains this little recounted incident, and it demonstrates how Dr. Lidgett is unwittingly making more than just medical enemies in Middlemarch. Yeah, this section, it's a bit like the narrator is passing on some juicy gossip. They were the ones that went to the Vincey's little evening soiree, the usual entertainments that go on in that household, and they've come back to reveal all to us, the readers. So, let's get started. Lidgett found it more and more agreeable to be with her, and there was no constraint now. There was a delightful interchange of influence in their eyes, and what they said had that superfluity of meaning for them, which is observable with some sense of flatness by a third person. Still, they had no interviews or asides from which a third person need have been excluded. In fact, they flirted, and Lidgett was secure in the belief that they did nothing else. If a man could not love and be wise, well, surely he could flirt and be wise at the same time. Really, the men in Middlemarch, except Mr. Fairbrother, were great bores, and Lidgett did not care about commercial politics or cards. What was he to do for relaxation? He was often invited to the Bulstrodes, but the girls there were hardly out of the schoolroom, and Mrs. Bulstrode's naive way of conciliating piety and worldliness, the nothingness of this life, and the desirability of cut glass, the consciousness at once of filthy rags and the best damask, was not sufficient relief from the weight of her husband's invariable seriousness. The Vincey's house, with all its faults, was the pleasanter by contrast. Besides, it nourished Rosamond, sweet to look at as a half-opened blush rose, and adorned with accomplishments for the refined amusement of men. But he made some enemies, other than medical, by his success with Miss Vincey. One evening he came into the drawing-room rather late, when several other visitors were there. The card table had drawn off the elders, and Mr. Ned Plymdale, one of the good matches in Middlemarch, though not one of its leading minds, was in tete-a-tete with Rosamond. He had brought the latest keepsake, the gorgeous watered silk publication which marked modern progress at that time, and he considered himself very fortunate that he could be the first to look over it with her, dwelling on the ladies and gentlemen with shiny copperplate cheeks and copperplate smiles, and pointing to comic verses as capital and sentimental stories as interesting. Rosamond was gracious, and Mr. Ned was satisfied that he had the very best thing in art and literature as a medium for paying addresses, the very thing to please a nice girl. He had also reasons deep, rather than ostensible, for being satisfied with his own appearance. To superficial observers, his chin had too vanishing an aspect, looking as if it were being gradually reabsorbed, and it did indeed cause him some difficulty about the fit of his satin stocks, for which chins were, at the time, useful. "I think the Honourable Mrs. S. is something like you," said Mr. Ned. He kept the book open at the bewitching portrait, and looked at it rather languishingly. "Her back is very large. She seems to have sat for that," said Rosamond, not meaning any satire, but thinking how red young Plymdale's hands were, and wondering why Lidgett did not come. She went on with her tatting all the while. "I did not say she was as beautiful as you were," said Mr. Ned, venturing to look from the portrait to its rival. "I suspect you of being an adroit flatterer," said Rosamond, feeling sure that she should have to reject this young gentleman a second time. But now Lidgett came in. The book was closed before he reached Rosamond's corner, and as he took his seat with easy confidence on the other side of her, young Plymdale's jaw fell like a barometer toward the cheerless side of change. Rosamond enjoyed not only Lidgett's presence, but its effect. She liked to excite jealousy. "What a late comer you are," she said as they shook hands. "Mamma had given you up a little while ago. How do you find Fred?" "As usual, going on well, but slowly. I want him to go away, to Stone Court, for example, but your mamma seems to have some objection." "Poor fellow," said Rosamond prettily. "You will see Fred so changed," she added, turning to the other suitor. "We have looked to Mr. Lidgett as our guardian angel during his illness." Mr. Ned smiled nervously, while Lidgett, drawing the keepsake towards him and opening it, gave a short, scornful laugh and tossed up his chin, as if in wonderment at human folly. "What are you laughing at so profanely?" said Rosamond, with bland neutrality. "I wonder which would turn out to be the silliest, the engravings or the writing here," said Lidgett, in his most convinced tone, while he turned over the pages quickly, seeming to see all through the book in no time, and showing his large white hands to much advantage, as Rosamond thought. "Do look at this bridegroom coming out of church. Did you ever see such a sugared invention, as the Elizabethans used to say? Did any haberdasher ever look so smirking? Yet, I will answer for it, the story makes him one of the first gentlemen in the land." "You are so severe. I am frightened of you," said Rosamond, keeping her amusement duly moderate. Poor young Plymdale had lingered with admiration over this very engraving, and his spirit was stirred. "There are a great many celebrated people writing in the keepsake, at all events," he said, in a tone at once piqued and timid. "This is the first time I have heard it called silly." "I think I shall turn round on you and accuse you of being a Goth," said Rosamond, looking at Lidgett with a smile. "I suspect you know nothing about Lady Blessington and L.E.L." Rosamond herself was not without relish for these writers, but she did not readily commit herself by admiration, and was alive to the slightest hint that anything was not, according to Lidgett, in the very highest taste. "But Sir Walter Scott, I suppose Mr. Lidgett knows him?" said young Plymdale, a little cheered by this advantage. "Oh, I read no literature now," said Lidgett, shutting the book and pushing it away. "I read so much when I was a lad that I suppose it will last me all my life. I used to know Scott's poems by heart." "I should like to know when you left off," said Rosamond, "because then I might be sure that I knew something which you did not know." "Mr. Lidgett would say that was not worth knowing," said Mr. Ned, purposely caustic. "On the contrary," said Lidgett, showing no smart, but smiling with exasperating confidence at Rosamond. "It would be worth knowing by the fact that Miss Vincey could tell it me." Young Plymdale soon went to look at the whist-playing, thinking that Lidgett was one of the most conceited, unpleasant fellows it had ever been his ill fortune to meet. "How rash you are," said Rosamond, inwardly delighted. "Do you see that you have given offence? What? Is it Mr. Plymdale's book? I am sorry. I didn't think about it. I shall begin to admit what you said of yourself when you first came here, that you are a bear and want teaching by the birds. Well, there is a bird who can teach me what she will. Don't I listen to her willingly?" To Rosamond it seemed as if she and Lidgett were as good as engaged. That they were some time to be engaged had long been an idea in her mind, and ideas, we know, tend to a more solid kind of existence, the necessary materials being at hand. It is true, Lidgett had the counter-idea of remaining unengaged, but this was a mere negative, a shadow cast by other resolves which themselves were capable of shrinking. Circumstances were almost sure to be on the side of Rosamond's idea, which had a shaping activity and looked through watchful blue eyes, whereas Lidgett's lay blind and unconcerned as a jellyfish which gets melted without knowing it. That evening, when he went home, he looked at his files to see how a process of maceration was going on with undisturbed interest, and he wrote out his daily notes with as much precision as usual. The reveries, from which it was difficult for him to detach himself, were ideal constructions of something else than Rosamond's virtues, and the primitive tissue was still his fair unknown. Moreover, he was beginning to feel some zest for the growing, though half-suppressed feud between him and the other medical men, which was likely to become more manifest now that Bulstrode's method of managing the new hospital was about to be declared. And there were various inspiriting signs that his non-acceptance by some of Peacock's patients might be counterbalanced by the impression he had produced in other quarters. Only a few days later, when he had happened to overtake Rosamond on the Lowick Road and had got down from his horse to walk by her side until he had quite protected her from a passing drove, he had been stopped by a servant on horseback with a message calling him in to a house of some importance where Peacock had never attended, and it was the second instance of this kind. The servant was Sir James Chetham's, and the house was Lowick Manor. Right, a small bit of drawing room drama of that sort of Victorian kind. The men of Middlemarch, they're all bores. Well, I think we're sort of in agreement with Lidgett on that, or at least I haven't found someone else. Mr. Brooke a little bit interests me. I would love to know about his youth, maybe more than how he is now. But really, I kind of agree with Lidgett. It's his opinion of his fellow townsmen. Now, of course, I'm safe to have that opinion, and Lidgett would be safe or safer if he was wealthy and powerful, because it would mean less for him to hold those opinions, because whether Lidgett realizes it or not, he doesn't hide his opinions well. I mean, he thinks he does. I think he believes that his sort of tissue curtain of courtesy keeps people from guessing, but Ned Plymdale didn't come away thinking he was all that great. And I think you need wealth and power behind you, like Peter Featherstone, if you're going to be rude, because then people will be too attracted to your wealth and power to think badly of you. They'll always have to counterbalance their dislike of you as a person with maybe their desire to be around you because you have influence, power, possibly money, either of which they'd like to take advantage of. And this little story sets up Rosamond as the one who must decide who does or who does not win the little drawing room conflict between Ned Plymdale and Dr. Lidgett. And that's why I chose for my thumbnail a 19th century painting by Charles Haig Wood, which I'm going to put back on screen now. And it's called The Patient Competitors. And I loved it. I discovered it after just searching various things I plugged into Google, trying to find a piece of art that would reflect exactly what was going on in the Vincy drawing room. And I think this comes closest to illustrating that scene. These two young unmarried men, and you can see they're both in their own way going, okay, which one of us for our efforts is going to get this young lady's attention? What does Eliot's narrator think of Ned Plymdale? Well, she says, one of the good matches in Middlemarch, though not one of its leading minds. Well, I don't know. I mean, how many leading minds were there in Middlemarch? So far, we have not been given any indication that there are many. So I don't think Ned needs to feel that that he stands out in some way, because he lacks wit or intelligence or, I don't know, whatever other quality Eliot might be thinking of or her narrator might be thinking of. So what makes him a good match, then? What makes him a good match? And what I think is interesting about the rest of this chapter is that there are hints in the text which reveal exactly why he might be a very good match. But we cannot go any further without talking about the book which Ned Plymdale brings into the drawing room with him and pages through with Rosamond before Dr. Lidgett arrives. It's called The Keepsake. The Keepsake was a literary annual, one of many. This was a part of the publishing industry which did really well between about 1820 and 1860. Every year there'd be several publishers who would come out with an annual compendium of verse, short stories, and illustrations. And there'd be a premium on the production quality of these books. The illustrations in The Keepsake, for example, were one-off copperplate engravings. They're very expensive. And the authors and poets that were chosen were either aristocrats or authors who'd achieved fame through publication and sales of their books, like Sir Walter Scott. And the editions ran to about 300 pages, and they were expensively bound. You notice the mention of watered silk, or leather. Sometimes tooled leather was used, and there was always a lot of gilt decoration on these. The average price of these literary annuals was 12 shillings. That's the average price. But better ones, better bound ones, and The Keepsake was one of these, could run as high as 24 shillings. Let's do some currency conversion. Let's say we'll pick a median figure for this issue of The Keepsake that Ned has brought with him. We'll say it's 20 shillings that he paid. That would work out today at either £145 or $195 US. So it is an expensive single book. And from what is said in this chapter, I was able to determine that what Ned had brought was the Christmas 1832 edition. You can still get copies of the 1832 edition of The Keepsake. There are some on vintage book sites. They've lost some of their gorgeousness just through age, of course, but you can still see the pattern of the silk. I'll put another picture up here. And that must have been gorgeous when it was new. There was a good market as well for these annuals. In my description box, you're going to find a link to a JSTOR article talking about the various publications of this kind and how they were specifically designed to appeal to the feminine. And our Ned, the narrator says, is very pleased with himself about how this mutual paging through in the book is going. And he says he believes he's doing the ideal form of paying addresses to a young lady. Paying addresses is a phrase that is describing the process of formally courting a young woman that one wishes to marry. Initiating courtship, of course, was always the man's job in the 19th century. A woman was to receive those attentions and then respond back. I wanted to find a complimentary etiquette manual for young men because, of course, last episode we read an example of an etiquette book for young unmarried women. I thought, what would Ned Plymdale have read through to consult for advice on how he should pay address to a young woman? And I was frustrated in this search. I could find books, yes, online, but they spent most of their time sermonizing, really warning men how to avoid selecting the wrong woman in the first place, before you even started the courting. And it didn't really offer ideas for what to do once you'd followed all their advice and you thought you had picked a very good specimen for a future wife. What were you supposed to do then? I suppose some men must have consulted mothers and sisters and aunts and so on for ideas, and perhaps someone suggested to Ned that a beautiful object like The Keepsake, which was where the publishers clearly were producing the book as a pretty gift for a woman. He probably thought this will be very pleasant to page through. It would be the basis for a lengthy but polite conversation, and it would also demonstrate, and this is key, that Ned had the kind of money that he could just go out and buy this book new. And that is important too. Ned is showing Rosamond that he has this kind of personal wealth. And while we're on the subject of Ned and his source of wealth, Rosamond, then one of the things she kind of fixates on with Ned is not the book that he's brought, but his red hands. Rosamond contrasts those hands with Lidgett's white ones, which she admires a little more. Red hands, what is that an indication of? Well, red hands means Ned must do something manual throughout the day. Either he's outdoors a lot, so he's exposed to the sun, or he's handling materials of some kind which might irritate the skin. You might recall chapter 13 of the book, page 130, if you're using the same Penguin Classics edition. Mr. Vincey accuses the Plymdales of using blue and green dyes to color their silks, and those dyes, the chemicals in them, actually corrode the fabric. What do they do if they make contact with human skin? Don't know. If poor Ned isn't handling the dyes in some way, he might be checking machinery, if they're doing any cutting or other thing. I don't know what they're doing with the fabrics. Are they weaving them? Are they just importing them and selling them on? Difficult to know. He might be moving stock in warehouse. You see, the interesting thing is that the business of red hands tells us so much. We know that Mr. Plymdale is a manufacturer like Mr. Vincey. Mr. Plymdale must be very senior in his business. And if he's trying to educate his son in the trade, it looks like we can infer from the red hands that what he's doing is making Ned do some of the ungentlemanly jobs in his factory or his warehouse or wherever, making him familiar at a hands-on level with the work that goes on right down to the lowest levels. And I think that's a very interesting thing, because by contrast, Fred doesn't get involved with Mr. Vincey's business. Mr. Vincey's second son does, though, and it might be interesting, what kind of hands does Mr. Vincey's second son have? Or maybe because we know that Ned is not particularly, he's said not to have a great mind, okay? So perhaps he's not an academic creature, perhaps he's not an administrative detail creature, so he prefers maybe more hands-on aspects of his father's business rather than the administrative, the clerical, the managerial. Lidgett's white hands, by contrast, they prove that he is upper class, because his hands show no signs that he's ever had to do anything manual. He's never had to handle things as a part of doing his job. I suppose the most he does handle are the files. They're very lightweight, though, and they probably don't put any stress on his skin. And poor Ned, though, I did feel a little sorry for him. I may not think he's very intelligent, but I don't think he deserved the treatment that he received once Lidgett arrived. Of course, Lidgett's not aware that Ned and Rosamond had been paging through this book, or that the book belongs to Ned. The book had been put to one side. And so by the time Lidgett arrives and sits down, it's just a book. Who knows where it came from? Inadvertently, he ends up insulting Ned, the owner of the book. And he does so by looking at one of the illustrations in the 1832 edition. And this is how I knew it was the 1832 edition. He looks at the picture of a wedding, a couple coming out of a church after they've been married. And this is the picture. I was so pleased to be able to find this online. I searched, and again, this copperplate came up. And it was created to accompany the final story in the 1832 keepsake, which was titled The Bridemaid, and was written by the Earl of Mulgrave. And I just love the illustration. Yes, it's very, what did Lidgett call it? A sugared invention. And all the illustrations that I was able to find from the 1832 or also the 1830, and I think I also looked at the 1836 keepsake. The illustrations are all very much like this. They're very frothy and beautiful, and they were the 19th century equivalent of chick lit, everything all frothy and pretty, or all the novels now, all the sort of romance and romantasy novels now and their covers. They're all flowery and pink and lavender and white and so pretty, and just aesthetic objects in themselves. And of course, that was what the keepsake was. But let's go on down that page, because Lidgett compares the bridegroom to a haberdasher and how he might smirk. Now, I don't know why a haberdasher might smirk, and I suspect that most of my viewers know what a haberdasher is, but I thought, well, let's not just assume that everybody who tunes in is like, yeah, haberdasher, I'm good with that. Let's talk about it. It's a word of uncertain origin, but it does go back quite a ways. The works of Chaucer use the word haberdasher. So it does go back into the Middle Ages. It describes a business that deals with all manner of things relating to either making clothes or finishing or accessorizing an outfit. So gloves, hairpins, all types of hair decorations, ribbons, trim for various parts of a dress, lace, and of course, bolts of fabric themselves. And some businesses would also call themselves a linen drapery if they sold a great deal of different kinds of fabric that might also be used for upholstery or curtains or table or bed linen. But by using the reference to haberdasher, what Lidgett is implying is that this silly smirk on the bridegroom's face, it could only be someone who keeps a shop. I don't know if anybody's been watching The Other Bennet Sister, that television adaptation, which is looking at making up a fictional life from Mary Bennet, one of the younger sisters in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. There is a scene in there in which Mary dances with someone in the town that she knows who owns a pharmacy. And when she sits down, her mother takes her to one side and says, okay, that's all the dances that you will have with that gentleman. because he owns a shop. Now, what she's saying is, this is a class thing again. Those who own shops were just, that wasn't what you wanted to aspire to as the middle class. You wanted to aspire higher than that. So here is Dr. Lidgett saying, he's got a haberdasher's smirk, but then he says, I bet I'm going to find out from the story, yes, that he's one of the leading men of the town. He's just making fun of how could a leading man look so cheesy, and that's surely the domain of the lower orders. He doesn't have to spell it out, but that is the message which comes across. And in response, Rosamond, because she's trying to keep a balance here, she doesn't want to appear to take sides. So she's a little bit teasingly harsh with Lidgett, and she says, I think I'm going to have to call you a goth. Now, what she's not referring to, and I think most of my viewers know this, she's not referring to that subculture that started only back in the 1970s, goths, with dark clothing and pale makeup and black hair and all the other accessories and music that go with that. Goth here is almost certainly short for Visigoth, which were the Germanic tribe who in the year 410 did the unthinkable, did what no one thought would ever happen up until that point. They sacked the city of Rome and contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire. And as with any kind of violent takeover, buildings were damaged and valuable objects were seized and taken away. So Rosamond is teasing Lidgett here, threatening to turn on him and call him a goth because his sarcastic attack on the contents of the 1832 keepsake, which, as Ned Plymdale points out, it's a book with illustrious contributors like Sir Walter Scott and a host of lords and ladies. And so, if Lidgett is attacking this book, then is he not just attacking the whole cultural framework of the 19th century, effectively? I might also add that on page 22 of that 1832 keepsake, there was a short story written by the author of Frankenstein. That's all the keepsake wants to say. I guess Mary Shelley didn't want to be identified at that point, which is interesting. But there were two writers who did want to be identified, and I had not heard of them before, but I found out that they were popular women writers in the late 1820s, early 1830s. So again, just falls right in line with where we are in where Middlemarch is. Marguerite Gardiner, who became the Countess Blessington, and Letitia Elizabeth Landon, who also called herself L.E.L. So that's the L.E.L. that Rosamond refers to. Now, the Countess was famous for writing up the dialogues that she allegedly had with Lord Byron, and most of her work was more journalistic than fictional. Letitia Landon was very well known for her poetry. She had two pieces in the 1832 keepsake, and it looks like there's a third bit of writing, which may be a bit of memoir from her, just because it's longer than one page. Now, of the two writers, I find Letitia Elizabeth Landon a little bit more interesting. Her biography on Wikipedia, and you'll see a link to that in my description box, which is hefty again, just like a bibliography. And it suggests, though, that she had a precocious natural talent from a young age, and she died very young. She was only in her 30s, and the circumstances were suspicious. I sampled the opening pages of one of her novels, Ethel Churchill, or The Two Brides, and I found there was an epigraph poem at the beginning of chapter 1, and I read it, and if that is Landon's composition, then I must say it's very smooth, but very beautiful, but also very clear. I just thought, wow, it's just almost liquid to read through. I immediately get the meaning, and yet it doesn't feel the way sometimes when people concentrate too much on getting their meaning across in poetry, and then the poetry itself feels a bit clunky and awkward to read. None of that. I immediately knew what she was saying without having to go back and maybe reread and consider the line again. And yet it just read so beautifully. I thought, I just love reading this. It would read out loud really beautifully. The whole text of Ethel Churchill, by the way, is available on Google Books and on Internet Archive, and you'll find a link in my description box to Internet Archive. However, it's not available on Project Gutenberg, in case if anyone out there has an ambition to transcribe a book for Project Gutenberg, but they think, well, what's left? Well, it appears that Letitia Elizabeth Landon's novel, Ethel Churchill, has not yet been transcribed for Project Gutenberg. And I love the phrase that sort of straddles page 270 and page 271, where it says that Rosamond was not without relish for the lovely writers who were in the Keepsake. So Rosamond has a secret liking for the writing of these ladies. And many of you will know that Eliot wrote an essay in 1856, which was published in the Westminster Review, and it was titled Silly Novels by Lady Novelists. Now, the novels that she chose to talk about were all recently published ones of that year. So in case you may be wondering, George Eliot did not mention Lady Blessington or LEL. They both had died, Letitia Elizabeth Landon in 1838 and the Countess in 1849. So we do know, though, we can construe from this that Rosamond enjoys a little light fiction reading. She finds that lovely. But now she's starting to regard Lidget as her window into the world of good taste, better taste. And I imagine that if he had said anything against LEL or the Countess, she might have stopped reading them. And I wonder, now I'm starting to wonder about Rosamond's reading. As a reader would, right? I wonder if she owned any novels, or if Middlemarch perhaps had a lending library from which she borrowed, she had a subscription so she could go and borrow a certain number of books every month. This is the BookTube critical perspective on Middlemarch now. How many books did Rosamond own? And did she own more than she read? And did she borrow more books than she bought? Which authors did she read and which were her personal favorites? I know one thing. If YouTube had been around in the 1830s, the algorithm would have loved Rosamond and she would have known exactly how to work it. Oh, and if anyone else was like me, a little puzzled by the bottom of page 271, I had to learn something here. It talks about a jellyfish which gets melted without knowing it. I thought, how does that happen? I have only seen a few jellyfish always in captivity in a tank, so you're not very helpful there. But a little online research has told me that if a jellyfish gets washed up on a beach, and because maybe the tide is going out and the current, it doesn't manage to use the current to get back into the water, its body has such a high percentage of water in it that as that water evaporates, the creature literally appears to melt because there's virtually nothing of it that isn't water. Again, that's Eliot. That's why I think that The Guardian has named Middlemarch as #1 in its 100 greatest novels of all time, and it's surveyed various critics and authors for their opinions and compiled them. And this is why I believe Middlemarch is such a great novel. You can never stop delving the depths of this book. Eliot just keeps dropping bits of knowledge in, things that you could read over and just go, okay, a jellyfish which gets melted without knowing it. You could read that through and go, okay, whatever that means. But it's worth looking them up. She never leaves you with something that doesn't give you some interesting insight if you do go to the trouble to look it up. And that's what I think makes this novel great. Not only does it tell a very realistic story of ordinary people with detailed observation and events that feel believable, but then there's just so much of Eliot's brain that she just keeps sharing with us. And that fascinates me, and was the reason I chose to do these meditations in the first place. We end chapter 27 underlining the fact that Rosamond and Lidget see their relative situation very differently. To Rosamond, practically engaged. In fact, she's thinking that should happen soon. I should be getting a proposal soon. Lidget, no, I'm completely unattached. I'm not doing any harm. Everything I'm doing is fine. I don't need to commit myself to anything. And he goes back to his rooms and he looks at his files and he makes his notes. And there's still in him a love for what he wanted to discover first. And here we have to go back again in the book because Eliot's narrator mentions primitive tissue. And you might think, what on earth? If you go back to chapter 15, page 148, if you're using the same Penguin Classics copy. From there, we learn that Lidget was very interested in the work of a French scientist, Marie-François Xavier Bichat, and he was a pioneer in the field of histology. He was studying the differences in different kinds of human tissue. But the building blocks of tissue, what made tissue in the first place, no matter what kind it was, that had not been discovered. That was the great unknown that anyone with ambition and the right training and the right equipment could try to discover. And when Lidgett refers to the primitive tissue being his fair unknown, it means that he still retains a great love for discovering this common denominator in all biological life. What is that building block that makes the tissues in the first place? That's what he really wanted to get to. So it shows that for him, his mind was still focused on his work as he wanted it to be. Rosamond thinks they're heading in a completely different direction, and that Lidgett's priority is to find a wife. And the last thing, because there's a little scene again that the narrator treats us to where she says that Mr. Lidgett was riding down Lowick Road in Middlemarch and Rosamond was coming the other way. She must have been on foot, because it says that he got off his horse and walked with her, and that he did this to apparently protect her from a passing drove. And you thought, what on earth? Okay, so a drove is a herd of domestic animals, usually cattle or sheep, but it can refer to goats, geese, pigs. It's possible to drove those animals as well. It's a small herd being walked from one place to another using the public roads. We still have droves in the United Kingdom. Here is a photograph. When we say small, I do mean small. You can see this is not a great number of sheep, and they're being moved down a public road. Now, I use this picture as an illustration because I could understand some Americans thinking, oh, is this like a cattle drive? And I think, oh my goodness, no. Your cattle drives were, well, they might have been something you might need to protect a lady from if she got in close proximity. You know, there's a lot of animals moving around at speed and maybe a lot of dust, and it might have been dangerous to be close at hand. If we're talking about an English drove, as you can see here, I don't think there's actually any real danger. Okay, there would have been no cars. In 1832, there would just have been the shepherds, the sheep, probably a dog or two, and you probably could have protected yourself quite well. I don't think any lady would have been in great danger. The sheep would have been frightened of her. The purpose for the drove is the same as the purpose for a cattle drive. You're trying to take your animals either to market, to slaughter, or to someone else who wants to buy them off you. One of those things. But I just thought it would be good to just show you the scale of it so that you didn't think, oh yes, he did a noble thing, Lidgett, because, I mean, good heavens, if we're talking about several hundred or thousand cattle moving toward her, she's going to be in great danger. It was more like what you see here in the photograph, not really a source of danger. Now, before we sign off, what I'd also like to just go back to is Ned Plymdale, because Eliot's narrator talks about him as a good match. And I think we've seen that the way in which Plymdale might be a better match is he certainly is more conventional to Middlemarch. He has more disposable income, clearly, and the prospect of greater disposable income because he's most likely his father's heir to that business. Lidgett, yes, more intelligent, better educated, fine, that's cool, but doesn't have a great deal of money. And I want to throw out a question to all my viewers right now, because I think you must have an opinion on this, and I'd love to hear it. Which do you think, Ned Plymdale or Tertius Lidgett, would actually be the better match for Rosamond? I mean, given her actual personality, given what she actually likes in life and the pursuits in her leisure time that she enjoys, which one does she actually suit better? I'd love to hear your opinions on that. So that is the meditation done for today. Now, those of you who watch regularly will have noticed that I didn't produce any content in the middle of this last week. And that was a choice. I am going to produce a video midweek this week. And I'm in need of a half-yearly review and a consideration of 2026 so far. And I'm going to share some stats and also some thoughts on adjustments that I'd like to try for the remainder of the year. And I'm hoping that you will join me then. So in the meantime, everybody, have good reading, whatever that means to you, and take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.